All right. Just like that, we are back with another episode of the RUCKCast. Okay. So, welcome back, everybody. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing good, John. How are you doing?
Too bad. Looks like we've got a guest this week.
We
Our
do.
first.
It's our first guest. First guest, and I guess for us, it's our first guest. Um,
Well, that's
but
an honor.
have you met us?
I'm glad to be the first guest.
So
Thank you for inviting me.
yeah, Jeff. I'll let you introduce yourself, but Jeff is actually on my team as part of my day job, and so we were having a conversation a couple months ago about something that just came out. And I was like, wow. I said, I really need to capture this as part of the podcast. And so we it took us a little bit with everything else that's been going on in the beginning of the year, but we have Jeff joining us. So Jeff, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and let everybody else know who you are?
So I'm Jeff Sojourne, and here at RUCKUS, I am doing product marketing for all the switches and APs. Right, I've been doing switching for many years at Brocade, and then Ares when Brocade was acquired by Ares, and now at Comscope. So I am relatively new to wireless. I've been doing wired for a long time, and today we're going to be talking about our new wired product, our new switch, in the context of wireless. So it's right at the the middle, the core of what I'm focusing on, which is wired plus wireless.
Well, that's good because John generally focuses on wireless and he knows less about wired than I do.
I hate
So
switches.
you
They're a mean to an end. You know, at the end of the day.
they are not, John. So um
Oh,
so since John, since you're the host with the most animosity towards wired, why don't you start off this conversation? Let's see if we can get you educated some.
all right. So we know about this ICX 8200. It's a brand new
Wait a
switch.
second. What's that?
Well, that's where the question comes in.
Well, no,
Yeah,
but what's the 8200? What are we talking about?
It's a brand new switch product, right?
Oh, we
yeah,
did.
we talk about a brand new access switch that RUCKUS is introducing. It's been we introduced that switch about 2 or 3 weeks ago, so it's very new. And that is, I would say, a replacement for the 7150. Even so, we're going to keep the 7150 for a little longer, right? So the ICX 8200 is going to slot it slightly higher than 7150, still very much at the entry level for our switchers. And so why did we build the 8200? Right, that's since we had the 7150. Well, 7150 had been designed about 5 to 6 years ago. Still a pretty capable switch, but what we've been seeing is an evolution in the campus network that has been accelerating with the pandemic. And let me take you through a few of these trends, and then I'll explain, how the 8200 is going to be addressing these trends, right? So number one is wireless first. So, I mean, for you guys, wireless first is not new, right? And, it's been, wireless has been the primary mean of communicating, connecting to the network for a while now. But with the pandemic, things have really dramatically accelerated, right? Especially with FlexWorks. With FlexWorks, there's more and more folks that are coming to the office occasionally, and they're not being assigned a cube or an office, so they don't have a docking station. They have, best case scenario, they have a display, a keyboard, and a mouse, and they connect their laptop to the network wirelessly, right? Because you can't have a docking station for every type of computers that is being used in the company. And most computers without a docking station, I mean, many computers without a docking station don't have an Ethernet ports anymore, right? Take, for example, on a MacBook today, all you have is essentially USB-C and HDMI. Right, and so if you didn't bring your dongle, you're not going to be connecting to the network through a wire, right? So really, the trend for not just the phone and tablets, but also laptop now is to connect wirelessly, right? So The other trend that I want to talk about is and that's for certain key verticals, is the move to fiber to the room. Right? So Ethernet on copper has been kind of stuck at 10 gigabit per second for a while now, right? 10Gbps was introduced early, I think 2002, 2003, roughly. So it's been almost 20 years. And today there isn't any really viable roadmap. You have 25 GBSD and 40 GBSD, but these are essentially designed for the data center with a limit of 30 meters, Cat 8 cables, right? And anyway, today there isn't any products for 25 GBSD or 40 GBSD, right? So some organizations, especially in hospitality and MDUs and also education, when they put together, like when they built a new hotel or when they built a new MDU or new schools, and those are built a little different than the typical office, where you lay cables in the ceilings. You have to, in these new buildings and new hotels, you have to put cables into the walls, right? When you start putting things into the walls, you know that you're making an investment for the next 2 or 3 or 4 decades, right, for the life of the building. And this is why they are interested in fiber, because fiber is pretty much, in terms of bandwidth, pretty unlimited. Right? I don't think we have found the limit in terms of the capacity of fiber. So they are looking at deploying fiber to the room. Also, fiber has become, especially single mode fiber, the part that was expensive to deploy was the transceivers, right? The fiber itself isn't very expensive, but the transceivers on them at both end of the fiber link so far has been in terms of cost has been the highest, right? But over the last 5 years, price have dropped dramatically on transceivers, like sometimes even divided by like 10 to 15 times less than it was, thanks to a lot of the Chinese manufacturers that entered that market, right? So now a lot of companies are looking, a lot of organizations are looking at fiber to the room as a viable alternative, especially when they have a long-term focus, right? So if you take these two together, this is changing the way campus networks, wired campus networks are designed, right? The access layer of the campus networks is used now. It used to be in the old days, like let's say 5-7 years ago, essentially you had at least 2 ports in every cube or in every office, where one port was for your VoIP phone and the other port was for your laptop, right? Now with wireless first, you have less and less of those ports that connect directly to end user through wired connections, right? A good half of the ports are actually used to connect wireless APs, right, for wireless connections. And I would say the other half is used to connect the other half, but at least a third of the ports for IoT devices that are connected through a wire, right? Like smart buildings, security devices, access badge readers, or HVAC, or elevators, or lights. All of this is also essentially all these wired connections that were used by users. Little by little, they're being used by smart devices. Right? And users are connecting wirelessly, right? So what that means is the access layer is really changing, and it's becoming essentially a wireless aggregation layer with a set of requirements for this access layer that is evolving. The network itself is collapsing in terms of layers, because you don't need such a deep funnel. When you have less ports at the edge. Essentially, you have less ports at the edge, but better, smarter, faster ports at the edge, right? Because now you have requirements to deliver higher bandwidth at the edge, and also more PoE power for all these very high-end access points that keep drawing more and more power, right? Every generation of access points almost double the power required, right? So that means that access layer now is again becoming smaller, higher requirement, and even though there are less ports, they need to be faster, more intelligent, and deliver more power, right? So I sort of, for what I call the new campus network, really at the edge, we need higher scalability because in the old days you had maybe one or two users, or essentially each port would see maybe a couple of MAC addresses, right? The MAC address for your laptop, the one for your phone, and if you had a virtual machine, maybe a third MAC address. Now each access port at the wired access ports can see hundreds of users through that connect wirelessly, right? So that requires greater scalability, greater these MAC addresses are they for layer 2 switching, they are known by the switch and they are in the switch table. So you need to have larger tables, more scalability at the switch level at layer 2 to be able to accommodate a lot more users, therefore on devices, therefore a lot more MAC addresses, right? You need a significantly higher capacity for each of these access ports because these wireless access points now, they are 2.5, 5, and 10 gigabit uplinks, right? So 1 gig is no longer enough. So these new switches need to have a lot of multi-gigabit capacity, right? We talk about power delivery, right? PoE plus at a minimum at 60 watts and PoE plus at 90 watts has become the norm, right? You need some room for the next few generations. Also, something I wanted to mention as well is the wired layer isn't upgraded as much as the wireless layer. Right? Typically, every 2 to 3 years, there's a new generation of Wi-Fi APs that come out, and you upgrade your Wi-Fi. Right? It's not the same for the switches. Customers don't want to upgrade their switches as often as they upgrade their Wi-Fi APs. At a minimum, they want to keep it 5 years, many of them about 7 years, right? Which means you need some future-proofing built in your switches, whether it's for PoE delivery or for uplink capacities, right? So PoE today, 60 watt is the minimum, right? And 90 watt is a must, right? Also, you also need a lot of connectivity options at the edge as well. I mentioned fiber to the room, but we also have wireless IoT with Zigbee and Bluetooth. Of course, we got Wi-Fi. So all of this needs to be managed through a single interface. Wired wireless IoT and even private LTE in some cases need to be managed as just one network, right? So these are really the requirements for this new world campus network, right?
Wow. You covered a whole lot of topics in looks like 12 minutes. So I kind of want to circle back into a lot of this stuff and let's kind of break this down in little segments. John and I aren't as smart as the average bear, so we have to have things sort of explained to us a little bit. So there's some things that you said that kind of want to, and my notes are kind of jumbled. So we're going to come back around to some things. One of the things you were talking about was PoE versus port count at the access layer. Can you just kind of quickly, go back into exactly what do you mean by the PoE versus port count? Are we looking for a lot more PoE? Is it by ports? Is it switch budget? What are we looking at with that?
Well, so PoE really started about 20 years ago or so, and it was introduced by Cisco to power their VoIP phones, right? So the requirements were, VoIP phones about 6 or 7 watt max, right? And that was the only device that was powered by PoE at the time. So you had every time you had a phone connected to a switch, you'd had to have PoE. But since then, over the last 20 years, the primary use for PoE now is really to power access point and IoT devices. And there is more. So access point, as I said, have evolved and they need a lot more power than it used to. And given that you can count for at least a third, if not half the ports at the edge that are going to be used by access points, so you need now about 50% of your access ports that need PoE, and they need to deliver a lot more power than what's needed to power a VoIP phone, right? So Today, the average Wi-Fi 6 APs is going to use about 20 to 25 watt, right? So you need PoE plus, right? PoE is limited to about 12.3 watts. So you need PoE plus. And then the high-end 6C access point or 4x4, 8x8, they go up to 35 to 40 watt. Right? So for those, you need what's called 60 watt PoE. It's the BT standards, right? 802.3 BT, right? So, and that's, 60 watts going to take you maybe up to the next generation Wi-Fi 7, maybe Wi-Fi 8 for some of the APs. But if you keep your switch 5 to 7 years, you can be pretty sure that within 5 to 7 years, you're going to have APs that's going to be drawing pretty close to 100 watt, right? The way it's going, right? And that's just APs, right? If you want to power things like smart devices or like flat screen TVs or flat screen signage or that sort of thing, you're going to need that 90 to 100 watt, right? So you've got different level of power for PoE. And so now at the edge, I would recommend having 90 watt PoE ports pretty much everywhere if you can afford it, or at minimum 60 watt.
Well, 90 watts of PoE across 12 ports. I mean, let me get out my handy dandy scientific calculator that I keep at my desk, and let's take a look. 90 watts of PoE per port at 12 ports. I mean, it's 1,000 watts. That's 1,080 watts. So
yes.
I mean,
yes, that's a good point. So you need to have switches that could deliver that much, that PoE budget, right? So this is why we built it. So this is why we built the 8200 to meet all these new requirements, right? So if since we talk about PoE, let's talk about PoE. For the 8200, we've got almost half of our more than half actually of all 13 8200 models that support PoE. Some of them, the gigabit switches, the switches that have gigabit access ports, right, which still the bread and butter for today's deployment, they support 35 watt PoE. The switches that have multi-gigabit access ports, which are primarily designed for those high-end Wi-Fi 6 and 60 and soon 7 APs, they have 90 watt PoE, right? And those, which we have actually a model that has 2 power supplies, and with 2 power supplies, we deliver north of 1,000 watt of PoE budget, right? So we have equipped our switches with the power supplies that are needed to deliver that PoE budget.
All right.
So you mentioned something else earlier about fiber to the room.
Yes.
And so I know I've heard about it a little bit, and some of the customers I work with have talked about it. What's kind of the vision? Are we talking like hotel rooms? Are we talking like classrooms? What's the application or?
So the verticals that we are seeing being very interested in fiber to the room are verticals that have buildings where it's not easy to upgrade the wires, right? Once you put the wires in the wall, like in a hotel, an MDU, or certain type of schools, if it's difficult to upgrade the wires, they're going to look for connectivity that can last as long as the building, right? And this is why they're looking at fiber. And especially, as I said earlier, fiber now is maybe a little bit more expensive, but not that much more expensive than the copper connections, with the drop in the price of the transceivers, especially at 1 gig. But even 10 gig transceivers are dropping pretty dramatically, right? So, if you look at the evolution of copper networking and twisted pair copper, right? Essentially, throughout the last, started in the 80s, right? Throughout the last 40 years, every time you had an increase in speed, we went from 10 meg to 100 meg to a gig and to 10 gig, right? Every time you had an upgrade in speed, you needed to upgrade the cables, right? You have started with Cat 1 at Starland or that sort of these very early twisted pair networks. Then we needed Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5. And now we are at Cat 6A for 10 gig, right? Which is kind of the minimum requirement for the 10 gig speed, right? So, with fiber, especially single mode fiber, that hasn't been the case. Fiber has been used for networking for a while, but really started with the current standards about 20 years ago, right? And we went from 100 meg to a gig to 20, 25 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig, 400 gig even now, and then we're looking at 800 gig. And all of this works on the single mode fiber, right? OS2 fiber. Right? So you don't need an upgrade of the medium every time you upgrade the speed. And this is the part that is very attractive for these organizations, is when they put fiber into the wall, they expect that all they have to do when they upgrade the speed is to change both ends of upgrade the both ends of the connections, the transceivers and the switch, and they don't have to touch the cable.
Nice.
You
Makes
said
sense.
something, yeah. But so now I want to go even deeper into the switching nerd stuff. So John, you can sit back and relax on this one and try to keep up. But you were talking about the cam tables, and and for those who don't know, a cam table is the MAC address table that is stored on a switch that keeps track of, hey, what are the MAC addresses that are directly connected into, that I see off of my ports, not my uplink ports, the actual ports itself. It's called a cam table. And Jeff, you touched on the cam table a little bit ago, and I'm curious, how is the 8200? Because you're talking about, we're talking about, wireless at the edge and pushing more towards that, and so definitely having, I can see the benefit of that. But let's talk about and try to explain just in a very brief detail, because we'd spend a long time talking about this. What exactly is, the upgrade, and why do we need the upgrade on these cam tables on the 8200 compared to some of our previous generation switches?
So typically, the closer a switch, you get different categories of switches at the access, aggregation, and core, right? And typically, the closer your switch is to the core, and the larger the tables have to be, because the switches at the core are seeing a lot more MAC addresses than the switches at the edge, right? And then the way switching works is when a packet comes in, you have to log, the switch looks up for the destination MAC address, and it looks up in its table and figure out what port in this packet needs to be forwarded to get to its end and destination at the layer 2, right? When you run out of space, the table gets flushed, right? The older entry gets removed, right? So if you got a lot of MAC address, you keep flushing your table. And when the tables are flush and there's no longer information about the ports that the packet needs to be forwarded to reach that MAC address, then it's called flood and learn, right? Then the packets are sent to all the ports until the switches rediscovered what ports actually has that MAC address behind it, right? So that is very inefficient if you use a switch with small amount of memory for these layer 2 tables. You are going to be flooding the network with a lot of packets in a very inefficient way, right? So again, at the access layer, it wasn't really necessary to have big layer 2 tables until we get to the wireless first era, where now, every port is going to be seeing, essentially every user connected to an access point is going to be visible as a MAC address to the port the access point is connected to, right? It could be 100 or 200 users, right? So what we did for the 8200 is we doubled the size of these MAC address tables, this layer 2, and actually the same memory is used for layer 3 table if you're routing packets, right? But so we have 32K MAC addresses, 32,000 MAC addresses that are there's the size of the tables for the 8200, right? That is twice as much as the 7150. And twice as much as many of our competitors as well, right? if you, this is where you need to know what the use cases are when you build a new switch, right?
Right.
If you just say, oh, it's an access switch, doesn't need a lot of table space, it's not true anymore.
And, I wanted to talk about this because, when we talk PoE, especially for people like, John, who, no offense, John, is a Wi-Fi person. And every time I try to talk to him about switches, he gets all glassy eyed and he's like, I don't know. He goes, I just know that's what I plug my APs into. But at my last
it's like
job,
a power strip, yeah.
It is. And we make that joke all the time that our switches now are just a 24 port power switch, power strip. And oh yeah, by the way, it does data. But my last job, I was forced to actually deal with the switching network, and so understanding the CAM tables. And so it's actually a good thing that I didn't know is that 32,000 MAC addresses on an access layer switch is just massive for anybody who's who doesn't know that. I mean, think about it as all of your APs, then especially, and this becomes really critical when we start throwing in some of the features that came out with Wi-Fi 6 with stuff like target wait time, where it's like, hey, the AP is going to store this client MAC address in its table, for, years, it's not, but well, it can, I guess, if the client asks for it. But anyway, I digress. And so when we have these APs, when they go on the spec sheets where it's like, hey, we can support 2,000 clients. That's what the table is on the AP. So this is where I wanted to talk about this, because it really does represent an idea of building a switch that does support that, because when our APs have more radios, they're supporting more clients, and the client table on the AP gets bigger, then we need to have a bigger table on the switch. So yeah, I learned something today, so we can call this one a win.
So scalability has become, you could summarize it by scalability has become critical at the access layer now that we have essentially people connecting wirelessly through APs, and hundreds of users are connected to the same access port on the switch, right?
Yeah.
So the other element is, like I said, we talked about scalability and speed, multi-gig speed for these access ports. But then when you have all this traffic, right? So all these access ports, we actually have for the 8200, I mentioned the 13 different SKUs. Out of the 13 SKUs, we have 3 SKUs that are multi-gig SKUs, right? That have 2.5, 5, and 10 gigabit ports. When you have all this traffic coming into the switch, you need to also have higher speed what's called uplinks, going out of the switch, right? So all our 8200 switchers have 25 gig uplinks. Right, those uplink ports can also be used for stacking, and that's something that RUCKUS, and before it Brocade, has been doing for many years, is using standard Ethernet ports for stacking rather than dedicated proprietary ports with short cables for stacking, right? So we used high-speed fiber ports for stacking, which means we could stack across wine closet, we could stack at the aggregation and core. That gives us a lot more flexibility, right? So with these 25 gig ports, we got up to 8 25 gig ports on the highest end models for uplinks and stacking, right? So that means you could use 4 port for stacking and 4 ports for uplinks. That's also very uncommon for access entry level access switches to have 24 gig uplinks, right? So in some cases you could say, well, it's not really needed today, but again, I mentioned future proofing for switching. If you buy a switch today, you need to be able to support use cases up to 7 years from now, right?
Well, it's funny because I was just sitting here thinking about something that, when you said the 25 gig uplinks as being pretty much a standard. I mean, I remember in 2016, I did a project, and, it was like, oh, well, all we need are 1 gig uplinks off of our switch. So, that's 7 years ago. It was, hey, 1 gig uplink from my switch to my distribution was plenty. We'd have 4 or 5 APs plugged into the switch plus some other stuff. And so it's funny to, when you talk about and we tie it all back together and we say, yeah, you do your switches about every 7 years. So 7 years ago, 1 gig uplinks was, was something that, we could live with. And now, it's like, well, now we can't, with all these other things. So I had to chuckle when you said that, because I was like, yeah, 7 years ago I was putting in switches with 1 gig uplinks, and we were like, yeah, that's plenty. That'll suffice for years.
I'd say 5 years ago, 10 gig was the standard, right? But that was 5 years ago, and now 25. I mean, we're the first one offering a 25 gig uplink at the entry level, in this price range, right? But you could expect that it will become standard pretty soon, right? 25 gig uplinks has been pretty standard at the mid range, but not at the entry level, right? And so this is kind of a first to have 25 gig at the entry level in these price ranges.
But I think if you think about, because you say, 5 years ago it was 10 gig was a standard. And I don't even think that's the case. I think, from a lot of our customers' perspective, 5 years ago, they were just sitting there thinking, maybe I need to go to like 2.5. And when you think about the evolution of where we've come from, when we think 10 to 12 years ago, just in Wi-Fi in general, and then you go to the switching infrastructure that supports it. 10 years ago, having a 1 gig uplink was, like the cream of the crop. And now 10 years later, we're, but it's accelerated so fast.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. So,
and very much it's driven by Wi-Fi. I mean, Wi-Fi has been on fire for the last decade or so. And we went from what's the max? Wi-Fi 4 was the max. It was like theoretical max 400 megabit or something like this.
Let's see, 802.11n on a 40 megahertz wide channel, 3 spatial streams was 433 megabits per second.
That's
but that was the PHY rate. So but we all know that we don't get PHY rate, actual PHY rate onto the wire. So 400 megabits per second was the maximum when 11n came out in 2009.
And now you are at 20 times this or something like that, right? So I mean, this is so Wi-Fi evolving so quickly in terms of performance and scalability is really pushing the wired infrastructure to deliver better speed, higher speed, more scalability, everything I mentioned. Right?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it just makes sense. I mean, I was always a big fan of future proofing, and I remember when MGig became a thing that I said, well, let's do it, because you can never have too much bandwidth. The argument at the time was like, well, we don't have anything that can really thrash it. We're not maxing out the gig links from the APs to the switches. I'm like, but when you do, you've got 2.5 or 5, whatever the case may be. And then so it's never a bad thing to think ahead, to the problem that Jim mentioned. If they had put in MGig instead of just gigabit Ethernet, they've got overhead. They might never use it. And the reality too is, in a lot of cases, without getting into pricing, because we're not a sales podcast, without getting into pricing, in a lot of cases, I mean, it's easy for me to say because it's one item, but it's not a huge jump. I mean, I remember I worked in a financial group at one point, and when like 100 gig low latency plant was like the bleeding edge, and I remember how much that cost. But when you're talking about financial trades, it makes a huge difference. But when you were getting down to the lower end stuff, I used air quotes that nobody can see when they're listening to this. It wasn't a huge bump to go from like gig to MGig, per switch. And at the end of the day, if it gets you a couple more years out of your switch lifespan, that's huge. So
yeah, I mean, customers don't like to upgrade their switches. It's relatively easier, I would say, to upgrade an AP. Like take the AP down, you just replace it by a new AP. For a switch, it's got a lot more wires coming to it, but also it's in terms of configuration, in terms of management, in terms of setup, there's a lot involved, and you got to provision with all the VLANs. You gotta there's a lot involved in upgrading switches, and this is why customers don't like to. They keep their switches for a long time, because it is it's not just the cost of the switch; it's just the cost of the upgrade and the reconfiguration of the network, with sometimes taking some of the switches down, that is problematic for them, and this is why they want to future-proof the network, and that speak to 25 gig and multi-gig and 90-watt PoE and all of this. That is really important to be able to keep your switches more than 5 years, right?
No, makes sense. I don't think I have any other questions myself, Jim.
No, I think we beat this one to death enough. We could go a lot further as Jeff and I have in some other offline conversations, but I think we've pretty much covered what we wanted to on the 8200.
It's great. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
And this is an announcement to all the listeners for our podcast. John has now learned what show notes are, and so he is going to add some links to our show notes that you can go to click on to learn more about the 8200, and you can get some of the more detailed specs that Jeff was talking about. So yes, that's a super inside joke. So so we're gonna have links in there that you can go learn more about the 8200.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Jim, as always. And we'll catch you guys on the next episode.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.